Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week's episode is a really interesting one. I have a fun and truly wide-ranging conversation with the writer, programmer, and technologist Paul Ford. Paul probably needs no introduction, but just in case, he is currently the co-founder of Postlight, a digital product studio based here in New York, and is also a prolific writer, having written for publications like Harper's, The Morning News, Medium, and New York Magazine. And he's probably most well known, at least to designers I imagine, for his really groundbreaking Bloomberg Businessweek essay from 2015 called What is Code? It's a truly incredible piece of writing and one that I've assigned to my students and have found myself returning to a couple times now. In this episode, Paul and I talk about that piece and the process behind it and kind of going through the editing and revisions and production of that, as well as his early interest in writing in computers. We talk about the early days of the web and building his own blogging software. We talk about how the internet affects the form of content and the current issues that are kind of surrounding digital product design. This was such a fascinating conversation for me. I've been reading Paul's writing for years now and just really love his brain and how he thinks. And it was such an honor to visit him at Postlight and pick his brain about all of these things that I'm interested in. So let's get right into it. This is me and Paul Ford. I was thinking about this over the last couple days, knowing that I was going to talk to you, and went back on Twitter and the blog that I had going for a while to try to figure out when I had mentioned you the first time. Mm-hmm. And it was like 2010, 2011 or so, and I'm forgetting what piece it was. But the reason that I bring this up is because I kind of realized that for a long time, I knew you only as a writer, essentially. Sure. And you were this like tech person who I think is a programmer, but I'm not totally sure, but also does this writing thing. Sure. And so I thought that was would be a good place to start with kind of which one of those came first for you? Was it kind of the technology programming thing or the writing thing?
No, both came, were there my whole life and came at the same time always, which is... Okay. Was always a perplexing thing about the job or about who I am and what I do. So I'll give you an example. My father, when I was like 6 years old, my father was an English professor, but he was into computers, and he sat me in front of a Commodore PET, and he said, look at this. It's almost, when you write these little programs, they're like little poems. Yeah. And so it's like the whole thing has always been scrambled up for me my entire life. I have never been good about preserving and respecting the boundary between what's possible with technology and what's possible with sort of pure, more traditional aesthetics. Even worse, as I get older, I've gotten interested in the history of the book and production processes, and I increasingly just start to see absolutely everything as a reaction to technology-defined forms in our aesthetics. Which means I literally don't get invited to parties anymore. Like it's like, he'll just sit in a corner and just yell. So
yeah. I mean, I love that you went right into it, just first question.
Oh yeah, no, don't. I mean, that's the thing. So I've never respected or been particularly interested in the boundary. The culture, my culture is really interested in like, where does good writing sort of begin and end? And I spent a whole lot of time hearing about how blogs weren't really writing and on and on. And I grew up in a creative house that was a chaotic house, and I grew up around technology. I had a computer when I was young. I lived in the town where Commodore Computer was.
Oh, wow.
Westchester, Pennsylvania. So I was always surrounded by these machines, like in school and elsewhere. And so, if you'd asked me when I was 12, do you want to be a programmer or a writer, I would have said yes.
That was literally my next question. I didn't want it to sound too reductive, but I was kind of, when you were growing up, what was that future? Well, it was just all of that.
I mean, that's the thing. I used to spend enormous amounts of time. The good fortune I had was that my parents were like, you talk a lot about computers. I'm like, I really want one. And they said, they had an inspired move. They're like, all right, if you do the research and tell us the best one to buy, and we'll let you get one. And I mean, for like 18 straight months, catalogs, Computer Shopper magazine, whatever the hell it took. And I was like, look, I think the one that's really the up and comer is this thing called the Amiga. And it was a Commodore computer, and it was colorful. And I'd used a Mac from when I was 10. My dad used to drop me off at the college library so I could play with the Mac. And I was like, I think this is the next step. And I exhausted them.
And how old were you at this time?
12.
Okay.
And I exhausted them, and they were like, okay. And I mean, in retrospect, the thing cost as much as a car adjusted for inflation, especially the cars we had. I mean, it was a ridiculous purchase. At a strange time, and it gave me a place to kind of organize my thoughts. And my father, again, he'd been doing word processing since, 1981. I mean, he'd been really early.
Right.
And my mom had used spreadsheets and been engaged. And so there was this sense of this not being a foreign presence in the home. I was like, oh, that makes sense. We'll all use that. And so you would and the thing is, I found the space that software created fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the good luck of having almost in the family, my grandparents rented a place to a man named Tom. And Tom was a communications professor who freelanced doing video production.
Okay.
And Tom was just a friendly, loving, kind person. And, when I was a little kid, he would make me popcorn. He was like, oh, come on up, Paul. And, always had like lots of folks around him. And he also had an Amiga that he used for video production. And so what I got very clearly, very early on, and this is something I try to communicate out as much as I can, an understanding of form and technology as a way to get things done. And if you learn a program, you could learn how part of the adult world works.
Oh, interesting.
And so books for as much as I love books, like textbooks are hard to read,
right? And
they're dry. I like novels. I like trashy stuff. I like really good stuff. But like cell biology is hard. Video production is hard.
Yeah.
And, all that stuff. And so when you get a piece of software, you can go into that space and you can intuit the profession and the craft from it. Now, what's tricky is, and this is always the thing from the other side, people go like, oh my God, everyone's going to pretend they're a designer now that they have these amazing tools. Right. But I see it from the other point of view, which is I can understand, I'm not a good designer, but I can understand some of the mental processes and the ways that designers think by interpreting and understanding software.
This is something that I was kind of curious about because I was kind of going back over your archives and reading a bunch of older pieces over the last week or so. And I had always kind of defined you as someone who wrote about technology or software specifically. And as I was reading through them again, I realized how much of it was actually kind of about design and about kind of how...
And other people actually see me as a personal essayist.
Yeah.
The thing that changed my career was I wrote a big thing for Businessweek called What is Code?
Right, yeah.
And that was a kind of a pop hit. And so people were like, oh, this is a person who writes about technology. Yeah. Up until that point, if you'd said, Paul, which is more successful, the personal essay, the technology stuff, I would have actually said the personal essay.
Really?
I'd been on NPR, I'd been in Harper's, I'd been all over the place as a serious personal essayist, and I actually was always advocating to talk in a same kind of literary tone about tech. And then Businessweek had let me do a piece about the Twitter API,
right?
And then they let me do the big issue, and then that sort of changed things. But up until that point, I think people would be, like the path I was on was more like write about your life for the Times Magazine.
In my head, the personal essays came kind of after that, and the technology was the thing that was driving it.
No, before that. So the process was like, I was kind of writing for a lot of magazines. Then I had this weird run where Medium, where I'm an advisor, suddenly just paid me and a group of other people to kind of write what we wanted.
Right. I remember that.
And I just sort of, there was something about the platform and where I was at that moment. And I just did a lot of stuff that I just, in retrospect, I'm really glad I did.
Yeah.
Personal essays, partly tech, partly not. Right. Some sloppy stuff, but some good pieces too. And that sort of put me in a mind of what I was really trying to do with Medium was like, can I talk to a big audience? Can I get, can I speak to in a way that hundreds of thousands of people are reacting to this? I'd never tried that before. And so I was using it to experiment and looking at the stats and seeing like, wow, I wrote a piece that's like 5,000 words and 200,000 people came and checked it out. That's pretty good. I feel good about that. And then I landed in the what is code space.
Okay. All right. So, a couple things to kind of frame all of that to talk about what is code. The piece, as you were talking about that, I remembered the piece that I first tweeted about of yours was about Facebook buying Instagram.
Right. That was for New York Mag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was 2011-ish, I think.
Right.
And
that
so
that was a reboot of my whole writing career.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'll give you this is going to be dry for everybody, but I'll give you like the potted version. Moved to New York in the late 90s, worked on the web. Never, ever thought anyone would let me ever write anything. Then started a blog.
Right.
And then that got picked up different places. I started to write for an online publication called The Morning News, which really was a great place to just learn a lot and try things. And I was able to do really good work for them and also really bad work. And they really let me try. I got a novel out of that, which didn't do well. I got on NPR on All Things Considered. But again, personal essays. No tech.
Okay.
Nobody wanted you to talk about tech. Then I got a job at Harper's Magazine where I went and became a web person again. And I built an archive and I kind of stopped writing. When you're in that environment, you're like, oh, I'm tired of the sausage.
Yeah.
And I, like once a year I would write something. And then I left and if I'm remembering correctly, Adam Pasek at New York Magazine, who's now at Quartz, was like, hey, I don't know whether he'd found me or like we'd met or something. But he was like, you want to write about this Instagram stuff? And because Instagram had just bought them, and I was like, sure, I'll give it a go. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And or maybe we'd done one thing before, and that piece sort of like got some pickup, and suddenly I was back in the game, and I was back in the game at an exact moment where things were happening, like Facebook was buying Instagram for $1 billion, and there weren't a lot of people who could make that funny.
Yeah.
And so what you're seeing, and what's funny is like people started to notice me again then, but what you're seeing is just like kind of 15 years of being a crab apple.
Right.
And then there's this moment where they were like, oh, that guy. And, and there wasn't, there were not that many people in that space.
Right. I mean, so I want to pull out one more thing from there that resonates with me a lot, and it's specifically blogging. And I think I mentioned to you before that it was through blogs that I essentially discovered graphic design and, essentially set me on the career that I've now been on. And so blogs as a form, as a medium is something that's very nostalgic to me in a weird way, but also something that's very important to me.
Of course.
And I feel like blogging for you also was this way that you could kind of experiment with these different modes of writing, but also the programming side and building your own content management systems. And so I'm kind of curious about your experience kind of in that moment where very clearly this kind of technology, the actual building side, but then also kind of building as a place to write, how those influenced each other or related to each other in any way.
Sure, of course. So when the web showed up, there were very few systems that made it easy to manage content.
Right.
Which today we would call content management systems. Right. And there certainly were very few that were cheap or free. And I was new to the city and had a little bit of programming under my belt and I was never a great programmer. Still am not a great programmer or designer. Really I'm kind of middling at lots of things that are currently very valuable in our culture. And so I
was going to say, I feel like half this interview so far has been you saying that you're not great at this thing we're talking about.
Well, or that I learned very, very painfully. There's a lot of second class quality things that I can really I can do. And I give up easily. So really, this is a disaster. No, I really wanted to. You know what it was? Is I love zines and I love the idea of like communicating. It's a very different time now, but I don't. And we also talk about how hard the media industry has it. But one of the things that was really clear when I was 21 years old and was thinking about what it would be like to be a writer and what it would be like to do things, it was really, really clear to me that I didn't have the right pedigree and the right temperament and the right look and the right angle to get into those worlds. I didn't know where those rooms were.
Right.
And I think what's weird is the conversation has really changed publicly about how do you get into that room.
Right.
I just figured I was never getting in the room. And there was a whole world of people who also were like, to hell with the room. Let's not even try.
Yeah.
Like, let's not get, boy, New Yorker's a great magazine. I enjoy reading it. I'm not going to worry about it.
Yeah.
Instead, I'm going to go to Kinko's and I'm going to write my zine about, weird footwear. And the energy there was wonderful. Just because you're 21. Like what you see is other people using the resources at hand to create their world, not waiting.
Right.
And that was the huge message. Don't wait. Just do it. And no one's going to really pay attention.
Right.
Because, again, we didn't have this vast platform. So there was very little chance of failing in public. You would essentially fail in like quasi-public.
Right.
10 people might see it. Unless you did something really bad, nobody would notice.
Right.
And so having the technology at hand, I got a job essentially kind of cutting and pasting web pages, but I also was really interested in tech and I'd been playing around with it in college. And so I was like, all right, well, let's figure out how to put this stuff together. And I wrote some Perl scripts that would take one text file and turn it into 20 text files, and then you had a website. That was it. And there were probably 100 lines. And boy, was it, I didn't know what I was doing, but, and then I would FTP it over to a website. I'd move the files kind of by dragging and dropping. There was a program called Fetch. I had a little dog. A little dog. And a little dog would like run when and
I forgot about that.
That's the thing. It was sort of fun. It's fun.
Yeah.
Like it was a wonderful sense of empowerment when you had your own space. No one knew about it. Your parents didn't know about it. Your ex-girlfriends didn't know about it. Like your friends didn't know about it unless you told them. And you had your own space and and that was a big thing about the early web. It was kind of private by default.
Yeah.
Because nobody knew where to look for you. There wasn't any Google. There weren't any identifying tracks. If you didn't use your name, nobody knew. And so you would put stuff up and you were in the web. You were part of it. And you could then change the styles, but there weren't really style sheets. You had to learn how to do that. And so to get the effect and first of all, you wanted to hit a certain level of quality. Like one difference between the web and zines is that looking professional has always been an asset on the web.
Right.
As opposed to like it's on pink paper with black magic marker and it's raw and from the soul. Looking like having a nice grid and lining up the type has always been, there's been a design element to communication from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And even the advocates for personal expression, somebody like Jeffrey Zeldman is a great example, Jeffrey was a powerful advocate for communicating, like using words, but also balancing that with really clear type and design from the absolute earliest days as an early practitioner around tech and building websites. And so that was the ethos. That's what's in the air, right? And so I'm responding to that. I want to make it look good, even though I don't know what look good means. Sometimes it's eventually CSS shows up and I'm like, oh, I can do line spacing, and someone's like 149% is the right amount, and I'm like, okay. Right? And I'd buy books on type, all the Bring Her stuff, because that felt like honoring a craft that didn't fully exist. And then people would kind of connect to each other, often through email.
Right.
And so what you saw was that a blank space appeared. There was this opportunity to suddenly really communicate. And there was a sense of discipline. There was also a sense of like, are you allowed to edit a blog post? And allowed in quotes, right? It seems crazy in retrospect, but there were instantly implied ethics about everything you did, and then people would be like, but wait, why? So I would write under pseudonyms. Was that ethical? I love doing it, though, because I would write fiction. I would feel comfortable lying in a piece and kind of saying, like, I'm lying to you halfway through the paragraph. These are all things that now, as a professional writer, if I was doing it for a magazine, would be huge, huge alarm bells. But at that point, I was messing around and trying to communicate to people I was messing around. Some of this is fiction, some of this isn't.
Yeah.
The pseudonyms were really clearly not real, and things like that. And so So what happened is you're building those tools, you start to de facto create forms. They're defined by the limits of your technical ability, and they're defined by the limits of the platform. So pictures are small because modems aren't fast.
Yeah.
Optimized with fewer colors and dithered. They are type and prose is cheap. You can have as long a piece as you want. Things should not be too wide because it's hard to read on a wide screen. More sections and headlines increase scrollability. And so, rhetorically, the web had its own native form. And actually, I think if you asked me the true, which you didn't, but I'm going to pretend
Go for
you did, the true native form of the internet to me is the FAQ, because it is short answers to questions. It's punctuated by individual blocks of type.
Right.
It's often structured hierarchically with tables of contents as they get deeper and deeper. And it's purely audience anticipating and responsive. It's not like an argument.
Yeah.
It's not a debate. It's like, hey, we've already had this discussion. Let me help you out. And let me do it in a way that is typographically actually quite profound, right?
Yeah.
Like, here it is. Here's the stuff. Here's the links. Next question. Often they're ordered and lit. I mean, it's like, it's often in ASCII and not really formatted, but I think it really is like the most pure expression of how the internet shapes form and communication that you can find, because frequently asked questions didn't exist. You know, the idea of Q&A existed everywhere, but that sort of native form addressing a community saying, hey, let's not hash that over, check this out, didn't really exist before the internet at the level that it did after people started being communities.
I mean, but so do you think that the form that blogging allowed, both the visual form, you know, that they would, how the blogs would look, but also the way you could write in them, influence how you later writing that is off of blogs, whether it's, you know, what is code or something that you were writing on Medium or for New York Magazine or something like that?
Sure. I mean, look, one of the things, it really, the platform changes a lot of things. So I had my own custom content management system that was one big file, which meant that it was really easy to point from one node or entry to another, and it would know the title and it would know how to link to that intelligently.
Right.
Other blogging systems didn't have that. So they tended not to be so self-referential because it actually was work.
Right.
It was relatively low labor for me to link to an other piece. Right. And so I had a much tighter thicket of text than a typical blog would. And I was aiming to create something that was maybe a little more encyclopedic about my life and my experiences. God knows exactly why anybody would want that. But at that moment, I thought that was important work.
Yeah.
Whereas most blogging tools actually encouraged people to write about their experiences and reactions at a given moment as a kind of atomic unit. And then that would get compiled into a reverse chronological list, and then it would sort of keep going, and you would experience that, right? And what I wanted was that thicket where time could be bent, and things that if an idea made sense before another idea, you wouldn't be beholden to read it in out of order. You could read it in the order that I, as a writer, felt was best.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And so I was able to structure that. I could put something before something else, even if it came after in my brain.
Yeah.
And the reader would have that experience if they wanted to traverse the text. This was not, I mean, a lot of this thinking was happening in the world of sort of hypertext, and, you know, lots of web people were thinking about it. And so I built something that kind of only I could use.
Yeah.
And that was actually a great lesson, because people who build things, even if they don't allow the flexibility and fluidity that everybody can use, that idea will take off far faster than the good idea,
right,
or the thing that you think is important, unless everyone can use it. And that was a huge early product lesson. Like, wow, if I figured this out in such a way to give them a box, maybe I could have built a good blogging platform that other people wanted to use.
Do you know Robin Sloan?
Sure. I mean, I've actually never met him, but we're in a lot of cohorts.
Yeah, I assumed that much. You know, because he has this term media inventor, which he likes to describe himself. And, you know, the I'm going to ruin his definition, but the basic idea is that you don't just create the content, you create the thing that the content goes into, and that those things can influence each other and can make something new and different than going into these kind of preconceived templates. And that's kind of exactly what you're talking about, I think.
No, that's right. I mean, what I do in that conversation, so I have a company and we build a lot of, among other things, we do a lot of stuff now, but about a third of our business is media and content platforms, right? Mm-hmm. And most of those are fairly straightforward. People want articles, they want headlines, right. They want slideshows, and they want them done to specific requirements around their business. But every now and then someone will come in and be like, I want to do, I don't know, something about hats. And I want to do the ultimate hat website. And so then to me, what becomes interesting is that the atomic unit of content is the hat entry.
Right.
Right. And so do you say, we're going to create a vertical called caps, right? And it's going to be where we write about the caps. Or do you create a system whereby people can insert just about any kind of hat and tag it as a cap so that it flows into the cap vertical, right? There's actually a big difference in how you structure that. But the key thing is that it's atomic. Like, what is it? It's the cap. It's the event. It's the article. Mm-hmm. It's the picture. These are really, and what you see is that if you apply this broadly, the tweet is the atomic unit of Twitter, right? And boy, if you add that constraint and get it right and do the right product work on top of it, it explodes. The wall post is really the atomic unit of Facebook, and everything else, and actually the image for Instagram, right? Like, those are the best parts of those products. Like, whoa, look at all this streaming stuff, all this great, cool stuff, and everything else is like, whoa, slow down. But that core experience is really good. And so Tumblr is one where they had 5 core content types. But basically what I've seen is anything that has true scale has a simple way to create these sort of widely understood forms. And within these widely understood forms, what blows my mind is how a lot of it is sort of inherits from a legacy understanding of forms. So blog posts are basically articles, op-ed. Or sort of journal-y personal narrative. YouTube is straight up video. It's a rectangle of a certain size that inherited TV's rectangle. Twitter was novel, but it inherited the SMS.
Right.
And so they're very atomic, straightforward units of content that completely run our lives now.
I mean, I don't want to stretch this metaphor too far away from kind of what you're talking about, but something that comes up in these conversations that I have all the time with, and this podcast is kind of at the high level about design criticism or how we talk about design. And there's this idea that, kind of subconsciously what we think of as good design or bad design is rooted in these kind of atomic pieces that you're talking about that are from a legacy technology.
I mean, how could it not be? We can't tell what's good. If you showed me what's good 20 years from now, I'd be horrified by it. Right. Like, how am I going? Because I don't know what the constraints are, and it's going to be way outside of the constraint systems that I understand.
Yeah.
And it could be that screens are spherical and you put them on your thumb like finger puppets, right? And but if you show me that interface now, I'd be like, that's a nightmare. There will be 30 or 40,000 little steps and constraints will get adapted. Look, there's a quote that I trot out constantly, which is, William Morris, socialist artist in Britain. He was writing about typewriting. He was complaining about how typewriters compared to quill pens just made it really easy to write. And he said this, which is, you can't have art without resistance in the materials. Which is just a defining quote to me, right? Like, you can't really understand what the aesthetic point is unless you understand what the boundaries are.
Right.
And so that's, which when you think about it, like, kind of all art, especially modern art, is utterly dependent on that. Like, I don't, Mondrian on a wall means nothing. It's wallpaper. On a canvas, it starts to make sense. And, that might be a little reductive, but that's one of those guidestone quotes. Like, I come back to that, and I feel that you can measure and understand form in terms of resistance. Like, how much can fit in here, and also in terms of who controls access to that form and definitions of quality. Like if you think about the New York Times homepage, there's a rectangle. Point to any rectangle. There's a team of 20 or 30 people who are in charge of that rectangle. And if you right now went over and was like, hey, I got something for you, they would go, no.
Yeah.
Get the hell out of here, right? Like, it's our rectangle. That's how we preserve quality. And it's literally about that space. I mean, newspapers are column inches, and you know, so there's a physical. I always think of it in terms of real estate, and like who, you know, and actually publications in general are. You know, they own this space and people's attention, and then they're landlords. They'll rent it out to advertisers. Right. And they're like, hey, you want this? You want this rectangle, but not the whole rectangle. You have to kind of take like this one little guy over here. Has a place for you. You're gonna like it. It's on the third floor. You get to look out the window, and the advertisers are like, yeah, I'll take it, but I'd actually prefer to own the whole frickin' building. And you know, that's how where we're at. But no, I think if you look and measure that resistance, you start to understand. The human factors and the ways that form work to define what flows through them.
Yeah, I wanna completely change gears for a bit and talk about what is code, because you know, that. I mean, first of all, I loved that piece. I've read it 3, 4, 5 times. Probably
more times than I have.
I've assigned it to students. I have it's the only physical copy of Bloomberg Businessweek that I have. And so I have a couple questions that kind of span from the very kind of tactical questions to a little bit more theoretical around it.
Go for it.
And so I kind of want to start kind of very simply, and I hope this is not a boring question for you, but I'm very curious kind of how you even thought about framing and structuring that when you were kind of like, I have to write an essay called What is Code, or that's about code. How do you even start something like that?
Well, basically an editor, in this case a guy named Josh Tieringo, who's the editor of Businessweek, was like, we're going to do a special issue on code and programming because it's a big deal. And I was like, well, that's awesome. You should totally do that Businessweek. And they're like, yeah, you know what you should do is write me like a what is code piece. I was like, should be about 6,000 words. And they're like, yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, it's long, but let's see what happens. And so I wrote that, and I was like, all right, I know it's supposed to be 6, but I got to like 8 or 9. And I sent it in, and it was very late. And they were like, okay, this is interesting. Actually, we want you to go a little bit further. It's just because it's going to be kind of a big piece, but it'll be cool. And I got it to like 15,000 words. Okay. And I was like, because the subject is vast.
Right.
And the more space they gave me, it turns out that by being in this discipline on and off for so many years, I had it in my head. Yeah. And I also had been doing all that writing. I'd been doing a bunch of writing for Medium, and I just had a sense of lively, fun, wanting to explain. Also, in the back of all this, I'm supposed to be writing a book on this subject, which is still late. So there's all this like still late today. So there's all this crazy like stuff in my head.
Right.
Which I should be turning into the book, but then Tieringo created the ultimate distraction. And so I got to about 15,000 words, and then they said, I remember the email really clearly. My wife was home that day, and I was working from home, and it said, hey, Paul, just want to let you know, we really like this, and it's going to be the whole shebang. We're going to give you the whole issue. And my wife watched it. She's like, I went to the sofa, and there was a blanket, and I put it over my head, and I still remember the sound. I went, oh. And she said, what's wrong? And I said, I am about to be judged by an unbelievable number of human beings. And at the same time, I was very conscious that an opportunity afforded to basically no human beings had just been handed to me. Yeah. Single issue magazines are very, very rare. After we did this, they became much less rare. Everybody pulled, and it got a National Magazine Award, so everybody like pulled out their big single issue idea. Yeah. But before that, it had been almost kind of decades since anyone had done it with a national magazine. And there was a real irony there, right? Like, I'm not a famous person. I'm at my core, and I say this self-deprecatingly, but also true, kind of a chubby nerd blogger. Like, I mean, I'm for real. Like, I have good relationships with people, and I've built a decent enough career. But I mean, the core of me is like a fat guy in a sweater talking about JavaScript. I mean, there's no alternate reality.
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, when you think about other people who've done this, and this is there's a knowing irony here that we all got. Like, John Hersey wrote a single issue New Yorker about Hiroshima. Right. like
Right.
one of the most foundational issues of the last century. And then Paul Ford, ? Wrote a single issue Businessweek about code, which is nerdy. Like, I mean, it was a very, like, let's see what happens. This will be ridiculous. And I was like, yeah, this will be ridiculous. And then tactically what they did is they just like, you have to come into the Bloomberg building and just kind of live here. And I did.
Okay.
And I just like went in and finished the piece. I kept writing and writing and writing.
So I'm going to ask you like 3 questions that are probably going to be really boring, but I think are helpful to kind of frame all of this. Yeah. So how long was that? Did that take? How many words did it end up going up to? And then how many, revisions, or what was that kind of editing process like to then get it in the magazine?
This was actually fascinating. So I probably worked on it on and off for a couple months.
Okay.
And it was, the piece I turned in was a little bit of a collage of pieces from the book and new stuff and so on. And then the process of expanding was like 2 to 3 weeks, like go.
Okay.
And I'm a pretty good reactive freelance writer after many years. So I was like, okay, here we go. And then it was like, okay, we need a lot out of you really quickly. And so that was kind of lockdown. Like, there is a point, there's a mode you can go into when you feel pressure where you're just pounding the keyboard, knowing that what you're going to get isn't good, but that you're going to shape it into something good. That's where I got. And I probably got to like 45,000 words or so. Okay. And then I sent that in, and then it was like, you need to live here now because you're going to need to rewrite a lot of this. We're going to add a lot. And I went in, and actually what had happened was my editor had really hurt his ankle. So he was home on Percocet, and I was sitting in his seat.
Okay.
Now, what's fascinating is the whole organization was set up with kind of like A and B teams to manage different parts of the magazine and have everything parallelized. But I was the bottleneck for the entire publication. So I made a strategic decision to just be unbelievably, as much as I could, polite and friendly and helpful, and to not have a lot of pushback except around accuracy. I hired 2 people to serve as independent fact checkers, even though they were fact checking inside, because I had one person who knew me really well, and one person who knew the history of computing really well. And I was like, see if you can find something. And then actually the whole editorial apparatus of Businessweek, of course, was also going after this.
Right.
And so it was a extremely intense, high velocity environment, I think particularly for me.
Yeah.
And there was a sense as we did it that it was getting good, but also that risk was mounting. This was the bet that was funny became a real bet at a certain point, and the website needed to happen.
Right.
And I would go in and try to help with the website, but it soon became clear that my only focus could be on the text.
Yeah.
And but I was able to go to stand-ups and be like, that's great, but that's kind of all I did. I was just like, looks amazing,
Yeah.
So, it's a funny thing because I'm the absolute center of the show. I'm not used to that role. I don't have the right kind of ego for it. I have plenty of ego, but not like that's a lot. And I'm a good production person with lots of thoughts about design and visuals, and I'm a magazine guy and a web guy and so on. And I really had to shut a lot of that down and just be like, what is the way to increase my throughput?
Right.
And also to advocate for a certain kind of accuracy, because technology and writing about technology is basically unholy in an editorial environment. I would have to say things like, you cannot break that line. No matter what it takes, don't do it. Or if we do, we have to put a footnote or something because it won't work. It won't make sense.
Right.
And meanwhile, and then lots of photography and art started to happen simultaneously. So I was picking up, a certain percentage of this, and it was an excellent and lovely and affirming team. I was paranoid to walk in because I'm writing about something. It's a very awkward position to be in because also they killed 15 pieces, including some by people in the room. And I just show up in my blazer and I'm like, hi, I'm here to write the magazine. And also don't forget, this is 3 weeks out. There's 2 more magazines that have to go out.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it was so important for me not to be, sand in the works, but I also was and so everyone kind of had to, having everyone work around you is hard. And just I'm not comfortable with that, but they did. And they supported like hell. There was one amazing point where it was we should have a list of lots of programming languages. So I went and got the Wikipedia page and I basically put 600 pages on 600 languages on a 2-page spread. And then they were and I'm working along, and they're like, we got to explain what some of these are. So I wrote 140 annotations, right? And then what I realized, they had a thing called, it's red balling, where if you, every proper noun has to be fact checked. That's their specific editorial strategy. But they're all proper nouns. So the fact checking and editorial team had to look up and affirm all 600 programming languages were real. And it was I still wish I had it. I wanted to get it. I had never seen a page marked up like that. Everybody jokes about it. The editor guy was like a Christmas tree. It was violently, disturbingly red from all the way across the room. Just this fire hose of checking. And so there was a lot of stuff like that kind of going on simultaneously, and a lot of can you please do this? Can you please write this sidebar, write this quote, whatever. And then I think what happened at a certain point is they're like, wow, I guess we're going to pull this off and it will be this voice. This will be the person. We added some framing to it. There was a kind of through line about the man in the taupe blazer. Right. And that was there from the beginning, but enhancing that, getting it to a conclusion. And then it came together. And again, this is an extraordinary staff, really, really a creative, lovely team. I've worked with lots of magazine groups and I mean, of course I would say this, but I was really lucky. This was a really good group of people making magazines at a time when making magazines is not as valued an art as it used to be.
Right.
And it was and they just owned it and they made it great and they edited the hell out of it. And it went out and it was true to tech. That's the feedback that the people I was most terrified about were the programmers, because when they the one error, and it's just forget it, it's over. And I got all the nagging about it, but it would be this barely even touches on microprocessors. I remember I saw that piece of feedback and I was like, I won. I did it because all of the criticism was about gaps rather than something else. And if you're not a programmer, you may not know how nudgy that designers are crabby in their own way.
Yeah.
They're just, but also designers kind of hate everything, especially at first, and then they kind of, unless it was done by a genius who they all want to work for.
Right. Yeah.
And so and that person kind of hacks out the same thing they've done for the last 20 years, and everybody's like, oh, this is great. But the new work that but engineers kind of hate everything, and they don't like their culture being described.
Right. Okay. So this is, I think, kind of why I wanted to talk about that piece especially, and I think can kind of lead us into the, start to wrap up this conversation a little bit, because something that I talk about a lot with people is kind of the relationship between being a practicing designer and then being a writer or a critic or someone who kind of writes about the profession, and the value that kind of being in the field or out of the field can have, but then also writing from inside the profession for people outside of the profession. Mm-hmm. And I think only someone who was inside programming could write what is code.
Yeah, there is. I think what software criticism is possible without being a programmer. It's harder.
Yeah.
But it's possible. You can say, lots of product managers are not programmers. Right. They're able to design and think through how a product should work or work with designers and engineers, but they synthesize. And a critic could do that. They could be like, I understand the basics on the design side and on the engineering side. When this product came together, or this website or this service, does it exist to, does it help the user? What is it reacting to? And so a classic school of criticism hasn't really emerged around software, but it could. But that attempt to get people over the threshold into a basic understanding of the discipline so they can hold their own requires a practitioner.
Right. And so how did you think about that as, you mentioned writing this and wanting the programmers to not be mad at you, but how did you think about writing it in a way that they wouldn't be mad and would be entertained, not just not be mad, but be able to read it and enjoy it, but then also a Bloomberg Businessweek reader would be able to read it and learn something. Well, that balance?
Yes. To be clear with the engineers, I was aiming for factuality. And is that a word? Factualness?
It is now.
Somebody needs to check it. I was aiming for accuracy.
Right.
But if they didn't like it, or if they didn't react to it or think it was the greatest thing, but they thought it was accurate, then I would have done my job with regards to my connection to that community.
Right. Okay.
The actual job and the responsibility that was given to me was, can you explain this to a large group of normal human beings and who do not have this domain expertise? And that meant what I refer to a lot as just jazz hands. Like you write we're back to the module. So actually, first of all, I initially composed, and I advise anyone who is blocked to do this, especially if they have a large task to complete. I composed it as an FAQ. What are the questions that people will have about this discipline? And then break them into sub-questions and sub-questions. It's a wonderful outline method because what you realize is, like, if you really have a clear persona for the reader in your mind and you like, will this question answer it? Well, I better break it into more questions. And if you do the actual FAQ, and if you look at the structure of the thing, it actually secretly is an FAQ. Each piece answers a question about, like, well, what is object-oriented programming? Well, what's an object? And you're breaking it apart like that. So I believe deeply and always have that writing is ultimately, there are many different kinds of writing. The writing at which I enjoy the most and is probably not, I do love a good literary essay when I can pull one off. But what I enjoy the most and what I think I've become associated with, especially through that piece, is the literary explanatory, right? Like this tone of, like, we're really smart. We care about language. We love to see how things are communicated. And what that buys you when you're explaining a relatively dry and abstract subject is you're in this tonal zone, right? Yeah. It's like, oh, here's this guy. Oh, that's funny. I wouldn't expect that to read that in a piece about technology.
Right.
Oh, you just did a digression about cats or something. Oh, we're back here now. And so it's you've got this straight through line in the FAQ format. And you've got an actual through line in the form of, like, there's a meta narrative about the man in the taupe blazer who needs to buy or has someone in his organization who is a programmer and a CTO, a head of engineering, and so you've got all these different rhetorical narrative things interlocking. So that, and the point of all of them, except for the straight FAQ answers, is to keep the reader engaged and get them from point A to point B and point C. And you have to change shift, you have to change register. Where magazines are wonderful as opposed to the web is when you really break form, they have a mechanism for doing it and turning the page.
Right.
So it's here's 2 pages, which are kind of like a bunch of illustrations and quotes, and it's done as like a little cartoon. Turn the page, and then it'll be back to narrative. Turn the page, full bleed image. That kind of variety is so good for the brain if you are hammering people with very, very abstract stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the FAQ, I think, is actually a really interesting metaphor, because I was also thinking about, occasionally I'll hear you pop up on the media or something, kind of talking about these things for people outside, and it's always broken down very clearly. That's FAQ. Basically, is exactly what that is.
Look, the root of that is empathy, right? Like, I want to get people over. If I can ever get this book done, I want to get people in the room. Like, I'm very worried about the fact that technology accidentally. I have a good friend who succeeded very, very well as a technologist, and he is kind of living on riding his bike, teaching people programming, and he's. But he didn't grow up rich. And he said, I was like, hey, I don't know, we were just talking about it. He's just like, yeah, look, here's the thing. I had the good fortune to live through the greatest capital expansion in the history of mankind with the exact right skills at the exact right moment in order to capitalize fully on that. And that was pretty lucky on my part. And it's just like, that's it. That's the right attitude. And then there's enormous amounts of power being centralized in these big systems. And increasingly, it's hard to get in the room.
Yeah.
And so I feel I have a professional life now. I have a company and I'm growing that company. We work for big clients. If there was one thing I could do with the remainder of my time, I think I want to find ways to get more people into the room.
Yeah, I love that. I have two more questions to kind of wrap it up. These are two questions that I kind of ask everybody to end. And we've kind of been hitting on this first one a little bit. But I'm very interested in, what do you see as the issues, the topics, subjects that are kind of facing designers today, and that can be kind of traditional designers, but also designers working in the product space and things like that we should be talking about right now? What are the areas, that need a kind of critical gaze?
Boy, that's a good question. Okay. That's a good question is how I say, I don't know. All right. First of all, I don't feel that there used to be kind of always like one dominant form of design, right? And it'd be like, everybody's gone down this path with the Dutch and it's just like, it's enough with the orange and, blah, 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 and type and this and that. And I don't think that's the world we live in. I think we have a lot of choices. Mm-hmm. I think that in terms of product design, one of the things I'm thinking really hard about, I'll speak about that. I'm not qualified to speak about anything, but I have a company that does product design, so I'll have an opinion there for professional reasons. The ethos of the industry has been that we should create really great, engaging experiences that people want so that people want to pick up phones and use their devices and make use of them and explore and play. And sometimes that gets bad, and it's Candy Crush and I'm addicted to it, and you find out that there are little addictive mechanisms that get built into these things, or you're dragging your index finger to reload Twitter over and over again. So we know there's a problem there, but what I think is tricky is that the fundamental ethos of the business drives people to create those experiences. Spend more time with it. We want to create enriching, wonderful spaces where people spend lots and lots of time. And increasingly, I'm saying to myself, and partly this is because of the work that comes our way and the opportunities in front of us, rather than trying to make someone stay as long as possible, what about trying to get them back to their life really quickly? And so when you think about how you spend human time, do you want to give people enriching experiences on a phone? Or maybe it's better ethically to go work for a bank and get them out of their bank account more quickly with a better user experience so that they can go about their day, right? If you save them 5 minutes off of banking, you've actually probably added an enormous amount of human utility back to the world and made people happier, better bank customers than if you create a new social network that, 5 million people, which is a trivial garbage number of people these days, are excited and motivated to use. And so I think that's, if there was an ethical framing and a way to reconsider design, I would say that we've created an ethos around engagement as opposed to an ethos around giving people back time and control.
That's a great way to think about that, actually. I mean, it's kind of this is kind of what you touched on in the 10 times frames piece a little bit, I think.
Well, I did, but actually at that point it was mostly about engagement. I just revised that for our Christmas card. Oh, okay. At which point I was so for people who don't know, I wrote this thing called 10 time frames, which was about the different ways we see products and being careful about spending other people's time. But really what I was advocating for there is make really good experiences. Yeah. And after about 5 years, I went back to that. I'm like, let's revise that and button it up. And only about 10% remains because I think what's changed is let's make good, beautiful experiences most of the time. But there should also be an ethos of just get them out of there and let them live their lives. Yeah. Let people go talk to their kids. They don't have to reload. I don't have to reload Twitter more than, like, I reload Twitter 500 times for every one time that I need to reload Twitter.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. My last question is, who are the writers, the authors? What are the books that have really kind of influenced? You can answer this in two ways: influence the way you think about these things that we've been talking about, but then also, I'm kind of curious, kind of stylistically, who are the writers that you kind of admire and are kind of trying to write like, or doing the writing that you're really drawn to today?
I like, it depends on kind of the mode I'm in. I like weird experimental essays. You know, I did the Harper's archive, like go spend 5 years in there. I love writers like Donald Barthelme or just where there's rapid, sudden turns. In technology, I felt that Ellen Ullman always did amazing work. Writing about tech and humanism while also being an incredibly credible technologist, like just really deep down, very connected to the work, but also exploring a lot of the humanistic stuff. And there have been a few others. Tracy Kidder did a great job in Soul, the New Machine. He's one of the, he also did, just as a general note, he wrote a really good book with his editor, I think from The Atlantic, and I can't remember the title of it, but it's easy to find. And it's about working with an editor and writing.
Oh,
and
interesting.
It's just genuine. It's just sort of, yes, that is the process and how it actually works. And he's one of the best process journalists alive. Like, he just really knew how to put things together. So that book was very influential. In terms of design and product relative, I feel you learn those by osmosis, and then you go back and kind of fill in gaps. Like, as someone who's aware of design, I've never even tried to get my head around color, right? Because it's such a discipline.
Yeah.
It's like a go get a graduate degree, and I'm just so.
I don't think anyone's really gotten their head around color, to be honest.
I have a friend who's like 25 years into his career, and he's like, I finally figured out how to work with a large palette, and instead of like three colors, right?
Yeah.
It's I'm mindful of movements. I'm mindful of I like manifestos. But I'm trying to think. I'll leave it there. There's just, I feel if I was to, I coined a word once. That's a horrible thing to say. Someone coined a word once for an essay in which I describe myself as an ephemeralist. And I
like that.
God knows my shelves are filled with books. We have a nice library here at the office where we're recording and on. But if you were to give me 4 hours and say, go figure something out, I would much rather trawl through old scans of issues or just look through bookshelves and let my brain put it together. Recently I bought there's the 1-volume Columbia Encyclopedia that has 100,000 entries and it weighs like 30 pounds. Okay. And I can't tell you how great it is to have all the world's knowledge in one book. It forces you to think about maybe the infinitude of the internet is more of an illusion than we think it is, and that it's human knowledge is really kind of messy and all over the place. And here's another attempt to compress it. Right. I'll leave you with this, which is that I have here in the office I have a facsimile copy of the first Encyclopedia Britannica. In the 70s, they ran them off and gave them away when you bought your Encyclopedia Britannica. Yeah. So they're 3 volumes. And volume 1, I think, is A to C. Volume 2 is like D to M maybe. And volume 2 is like D to G. And then volume 3 is like H to Z, right? Yeah. And volume 1 is the thickest. They're like, let's get all human knowledge into a book, right? Yeah. And they got up to C and they're like, oh my God, we're screwed. We won't be done until 1850. And so it just keeps getting compressed and compressed in order to meet the deadline. Yeah. And you can see it in the 3 volumes. It's terrible. And A to C is very robust. I think it's got all sorts of stuff. And the entries are hilarious because they're literally trying to figure out how to write about the world in an encyclopedic way. Yeah. So I actually love artifacts like that where you see the production and you see the first of anything is always really interesting. I guess the last bit is like early computer manuals, the guides to the Unix systems admin manuals and how to program in C were written for an audience that had no idea what this all was.
Right.
And they're wonderful.
Oh, that's interesting.
They're
Yeah.
extremely clear. And they just assume that like, oh, you're going to be writing some code to control an industrial refrigeration system. You're a relatively bright person, but it's fundamentally clerical. Let's get you into this world and help you understand the basics.
Yeah.
And it's going to probably take you a year or two to get good, and that's fine.
Yeah.
As opposed to this assumption like, you don't know? Oh
Right,
my
right.
God, go learn. You're an idiot. Like, it's none of that. It's just a nice, professional, respectful tone, and it's very clear. And I admire that immensely.
I just want to say that, I've interviewed, 50, 60 people, and no one has ever said the encyclopedia when I asked that last question of kind of the books that are influential to them. So that's the best. You can't top that answer.
I do. I love a good encyclopedia.
Thank you so much. I could talk to you forever. This was so interesting.
I know this is fun. I'm sad I have to get back to work.
Yeah, no, you should go do that. This was great. Thank you so much for talking.
It's my privilege. Thank you.
This episode was recorded on December 8th, 2017 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.